Hey, this is Darren. I've been working with yarn for over 20 years, and over that time, I've learned quite a bit and picked up a lot of tricks. And now with the help of my friends from Joann's, I'm going to be able to share some of that knowledge with you. Okay, I think we have everything we need. Let's go home and make stuff.
Welcome everybody to Crochet 102 on this Friday afternoon, possibly snowy depending upon where you're joining us from. Darren is your teacher there on screen, modeling the hat that we're going to show you how to make at the end of class. Hopefully, maybe you all joined us earlier this week for Crochet 101 and have been practicing. In this class, we're going to learn a few more stitches and how to join yarn to add stripes like to that hat there, or if you need to learn how to join a new ball. As always, this class is going to be recorded, and so if you need to watch it back again, you can do that on the Lion Brand YouTube channel about 24 to 48 hours after class. It's probably going to be early next week since we are headed into the weekend here. And if you need the handout, I'll be putting that link into the chat here so you can download it. You should also have the link in your confirmation email. And now, and just a reminder that we do have a little bit of a delay from what we're doing live to what you're seeing on YouTube, but that shouldn't affect us answering any questions at all. And now that that is everything out of the way, we'll let Darren take over.
All right, welcome to class. This is Crochet 2. So today we're going to be learning about how to do some different stitches. We're going to learn how to do half double, double, and triple, and then a few other tricks we're going to learn. And like Claire said, then we're going to review the pattern, how to make this hat. So everything you need to learn to make this hat, we will cover today, in addition to several other things that you don't need for the hat. So we've got a lot to cover today. In class today, I'm going to be using Hometown yarn for demonstrating because it is a thick yarn and it shows up nice on camera. So the color I'm going to be using is Dallas Gray. But for the class and for class preparations, it asked you to get Heartland, which is what you're going to need for the hat. So that's why I'm using, sometimes there's questions about why I'm using a different yarn than what was suggested. This one, because it's so thick, it shows up nicer on camera because, you know, I want everyone to be able to see exactly where the needles are going. So that being said, let's go ahead and switch to the view of my hands and we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to use this hook. This hook is, it's an N13 or 9 millimeter, and that's what this yarn is recommending. So you always want to double check and make sure you're using the hook that's recommended. You can go up or down one size usually, and it's not a huge crisis. So all the yarn there that I'm using today and that I've talked about is available on joanns.com or on lionbrand.com. So you'll be able to get all of them. Okay. So any questions about the yarn or what we're doing? Okay. So first thing you need to do is tie a slip knot. And I covered this last class, but I'll just briefly touch on it. So you make a loop, you put your tail over your working yarn. And so you put the short piece over the long. So it's short over long. You put your hand inside the circle, grab hold of the tail, and then you're going to hold the tail and the working yarn together. And you're just going to loop the tail back through. And that's how you do a slip knot. And it's extra nice in crochet if the tail is what controls the size of the knot. Pop your hook on there. You want to cinch it up so it's snug. It shouldn't be tight. Everything should kind of flow smoothly. And you want to leave at least 6 to 8 inches. This is a little long, but you want to make sure you leave at least 6 to 8 inches for finishing later. Okay. And so I'm going to chain to give me some. Always try to chain a little looser than you think you should. Chains tend to become very tight. Okay, I lost count what I was doing, but we'll count the chain and see where we are. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So I have 13. I'm going to pull 3 out. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You don't count, remember, you don't count the loop that's on your hook as a chain. So I'm going to do half double crochet. I want to work with 10 stitches. So I started out with a chain of 10 for each one of my stitches. Now for crochet though, you always have to have extra stitches that create the side edge. And so I'm going to chain 2 extra stitches that will create, they won't be part of my stitches, but what they're going to do is they're going to be turned up on their side and become the height for that next row. If you didn't do that, your first stitch would have to be kind of pushed in and slanted, and it wouldn't be very nice. So I'm going to work with 10 stitches. I did an extra chain, 2 extra chains to create my height. And you'll kind of see why that is necessary as I go on. All right. So with half double crochet, the first thing you do is you bring the yarn over your needle or your hook. So I have 2 loops on my hook. I'm going to skip the first 2, 1, 2, and then I'm going to go in, bring up a loop. Now I have 3 loops on my hook. Yarn over and pull that through all 3. And that is my half double. Yarn over, go in the next chain, yarn over, bring up a loop, yarn over, pull it through all 3. I'm going to stop right here for a second, and I'm going to pop a stitch marker right on that first stitch. And that way it's going to help me keep track of where my stitches are, where they stop and start, because sometimes it's easy to add a stitch or lose a stitch, and that's going to help us keep track. So yarn over, enter your chain, yarn over, bring up a loop, yarn over, bring it through all 3. Okay. Any questions? Any questions about what I'm doing or why? Any particular step not being clear?
Can you just remind us how this is different from the single crochet stitch we learned earlier?
Yeah, so I'll do a single. So for single, the first step of a single is to just enter the chain or your stitch, whatever row you're on. So you enter, wrap your stitch, wrap your yarn, bring it up, 2 loops on the hook, bring it through both. So the single crochet is you just enter, bring up, have 2 loops, and then pull it through both. Half double is different because you start with a yarn over, and you don't do that with single. So you start with the yarn over, enter the stitch, bring up a loop, and now I have 3, bring it through all 3. Okay, is that clear?
That's good. And so that extra loop that we're doing, basically this stitch is going to be a little bit taller than our single crochet, right?
Yeah, it creates a little extra height, and it also makes this stitch a little bit more flexible. If you were to make a piece of fabric out of just solid single crochet, it would be a little more dense and a little bit stiffer. It would be nice and warm for like a hat or maybe gloves or something. But if you do half double, it does make the fabric a little more flexible. It opens it up a little bit more, but it's still very warm and a nice solid fabric. Okay. So my last stitch, I'm going to pop a stitch marker on there so I can keep track of where I am. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have 10 stitches, so I'm in good shape. And it's a good idea when you're practicing to, if you're just practicing, like don't cast on or don't chain like 50 or 100 stitches and just work across. It's much nicer if you only have a few stitches, like 10 or 15, because then you can count them at the end of each row to make sure you're not losing or gaining stitches. And it's easy to kind of keep track. If you do make a mistake, you might be able to figure out where that mistake was. And so now I need to chain 2 to create
before
the
we go
height.
to the next row, Darren,
Okay.
we've got a question. Are you always supposed to enter the chain the way that you're showing from the top there?
There are the original chain down here. There are three different ways, there are at least 3 different ways of entering the chain. And the way that I was showing is probably the easiest way. If you know one of the other ways to enter the chain, then you're welcome to do it however you want to do it. But in this class, it takes a lot of time to go through all the different ways of entering the chain. And so I don't usually cover that in class. But just know there are at least three ways of entering the chain. Okay. Anything else?
I think we talked a little bit more about that in the Crochet 101 class.
Yes.
So you can check that video for a little bit more discussion.
But yeah, I don't go through all the different ways because it does take up quite a bit of time and we only have an hour. So, okay, so after you finish your row, I have to do my chain 2 to create the height for my half double, and that's going to kind of go up the side. Turn your work. And now it's super easy to see where my first stitch is because I have it marked. And that might seem silly, but once you get into this, sometimes it's hard to tell, is that my first stitch right there? Or, sometimes it's hard to tell where it is. But once you get the hang of it, it's easy to tell. But as you're learning, it's nice to have a stitch marker to guide you. So I'm going to yarn over, and then you're going to go under both. This time we are going under both strands of yarn on the row below. Yarn over, 3 loops on my hook, yarn over, pull it through all 3. And it's kind of easier to pull it through all 3 if you turn your hook so it's facing down, so that the mouth of the hook is down. And I tend to kind of pull my work gently down because it helps to open up the space underneath the hook, so that when you pull it through, there's room for that hook. And sometimes you have to tease it through. Okay. And then I'm going to take my stitch marker off, and I'm going to put it right there on that stitch. And then when I come back to it, I'll know exactly where I am. So yarn over. If you look at the top of your row, you have these kind of V shapes, but you have 2 strands of yarn, and that each one of those counts as a stitch. So yarn over. If you look at it from the side, you can kind of find these openings. You can kind of feel for them. So you can either look at the top of it to find the stitch. You can kind of find this hole, or if you find this post, that kind of marks where your stitches are too. So there's different ways of looking at it. As long as you're going through this hole and under both for this stitch, then you're correct. And there are other ways of doing it that you can learn later on that are more advanced. I don't think there's just one way of doing anything in knitting or crochet. I think there's always several options. Any questions?
I think we're doing good so far.
I yarned over. All right. So this is half double. Are we ready to go to double, or do we want to see half double again? Seems like people seem to have it. All right, so this is a good place to like just look for a second. So this is nice big yarn, so it's easy to see what I'm doing. But if your yarn's thinner, or if your stitches are really loose and kind of stretched out like that, it's sometimes hard to see where the end is. So that almost, in a certain situation, that might look more like it's the end, like I've done my last stitch. But as we can see, because my stitch marker is there, I know I have one more to do. And with this yarn, it's easy to see. So, depending on the yarn you're using, sometimes it's easier than others. And sometimes, if you're doing a looser stitch. But I really recommend, using your stitch markers for the first and the last, because that way there's no question that's your last stitch. And so I'm going to yarn over, do my last, and that's of course how you would skip a stitch if I skipped that one and went back, and then I would have 9 stitches instead of 10. So that's an easy way to make a mistake. And then another way to make a mistake, I'm going to take this off. And again, this yarn's pretty clear to see, and that's why I choose this yarn for teaching. But sometimes you might be like, is that a stitch? And I can totally put a stitch there. Oh, it must have been a stitch, because I totally was able to put a stitch there. But we know it's not, because we saw where my stitch was before. And if you count, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, so that wasn't a stitch. So take it out. But it's easy. It's really easy to make a mistake. And that's where you might add or subtract a stitch by accident. And these stitch markers really come into play. Okay, so we're ready to see double?
Let's go for it.
Okay, so for double, I'm going to chain 3 for the height, because that one's a little bit, they progressively get a little bit taller. Excuse me. So, same basic principles for double. Clearly, I can see where my first stitch is because I've got it marked. So I'm going to take that out. And with double, you start with a yarn over, enter that stitch, bring up a loop. Now I have 3 loops on my hook, and this is pretty much how I have double starts. Yarn over, bring it through 2 loops on my hook, yarn over, bring it through 1, and that is a double crochet. So yarn over, find the next stitch. I'm going to go ahead and pop my stitch marker on. So yarn over, enter the stitch, bring up a loop, 3 on my hook, yarn over, pull it through 2, yarn over, pull it through 2. Okay, look at the top of your work to see your next stitch. So it's right here. Look for that V shape, or look for the hole. So yarn over, enter the stitch, bring up a loop, through 2, go through 2. Any questions? How we doing?
I think we're doing pretty good. I was just going to say, I think in case you're confused about how many loops to pull through in half double versus double, I think it's nice that, double is called double because you're pulling through 2 loops twice.
Yes.
So that's easy for me to remember how to do it, at least.
Yeah. I kind of think of it as every time you pull it through, that's technically a crochet, because this is double crochet. So there's crochet, crochet, I'm done. So I did 2 crochets. Like, I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone else, but yeah, it's just like what Claire was saying, because you're pulling it through twice, that's a double. So bring up a loop, pull it through 2, pull it through 2, and that's a double because you're pulling it through twice. Okay. Any questions? Okay, and here's my last stitch. I've got it marked. Pull it through 2, pull it through 2, and then chain 3 if you're going to do another row of doubles. Well, we can see that there is quite a difference. So for a double, the stitches are quite a bit taller. You can really see this post right here. Sometimes you work around that post or do different things with it. So it's nice to start looking at your fabric and start looking at the different parts of the stitch to get familiar with them. So this is your post. And then at the top of the stitch, this is your front loop because it's closest to you, and this is your back loop. And sometimes you're going to hear different stitches that involve just the front loop or just the back loop or maybe the post, but that's for future learning. But just start looking at your stitches as you're making them and get comfortable with the anatomy. Down here is the half double, and you can see it's much shorter, quite a bit shorter. And so that makes, and that the fabric isn't as open. So this is quite a bit open. And so for a different project, that would be just the perfect stitch. Sometimes half double is better, sometimes single is better. It just depends on what you're making. So any questions?
I think for a lot of people, probably double crochet is the most used stitch because I think that's what's most frequently used in granny squares, if you're familiar with those.
Yeah, granny squares are a lot of fun. So yeah, so double and half double. I use half double a lot because I really like a half double. I like the fabric that it makes. I like the motion, like the rhythm of making them. So, it really just depends. But the pattern, if you're following a pattern, the pattern will tell you what to use. So any questions about half double? Do we want to see triple? Are we ready to move on, or do we want to see it again? How are we doing?
I think we can go ahead with the triple crochet.
Okay. So I finished my stitch. I finished my row. And so for triple, you have to chain 4 because it's getting even taller. So chain 4. And so you can see, I want people to, as you're learning, to realize that this chain 4, it's creating the side. It's creating the side, the height for the next row. Same when we did our chain, we chained 10, and we chained those 2 extra, and that created the height for the little side row down here. So we always have to build up to make the edge. And we turn our work. And with triple, you yarn over twice. And I can clearly see where my stitch is. I've got it marked. So you enter the stitch, bring up a loop. And with double, we pull it through 2, pull it through 2, and triple, it just keeps progressing. We're going to do it 3 times. So yarn over, pull it through 2, pull it through 2, and pull it through 2. So you can see we did it 3 times. So that it helps to remember that that's a triple because you do it 3 times. So 1, 2, yarn over twice, I'm going to put this on to mark my first stitch. So yarn over twice, bring it through 2, bring it through 2, and bring it through 2. Very tall stitch. Yarn over twice, enter the stitch, bring up a loop. I have 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yarn over, bring it through 2. Now I have 3. Yarn over, bring it through 2. Now I have 2. Yarn over, bring it through 2. And you can see if you were to do several rows of this stitch, you really add a lot to your work each time. You could make a triple crochet scarf out of super bulky yarn like this in no time. It would work up so fast. Any questions about the triple?
I put it in the chat, but I also wanted to highlight it here, that you might see triple crochet called treble crochet in a pattern.
Yes. Why do they do that, Claire? Are they just trying to confuse us?
Maybe, who knows? There are so many names for stitches, and they're all the different names for the same stitch, and who knows?
Okay, so Claire, I have another question for you then. Maybe you can explain this better than I can. Just so everybody knows to look out for this problem. Talk a little bit about like the British crochet terms compared to the American ones. Do you know how they're different? I know they are different, but I always forget how exactly.
They are different, and I think the British terms are basically, how best to explain this? So, like, a British treble crochet is an American double crochet, and a British half double crochet is an American single, I think.
Something like that. Yeah, I always get it. So just so that the students know, when you're following a pattern, make sure that, or watching a video, if they have an English accent, then maybe, just double check and watch what they're doing. And just if you're reading a pattern, make sure you know kind of like where it's from, because it can be quite different. So.
Yes, I know all of our Lion Brand patterns and all of our kits and that are written with U.S. crochet terminology. And I think probably most patterns will specify which country's definitions they're using, but you can also check the pattern should have an abbreviations guide. And hopefully that might have a little explanation as well.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to change colors. I think I'm going to run out of yarn before I get to the end. I wanted to do it on the end, so it made more sense. Let me pull these out. So no questions about half double, double, or triple. Any questions at all? Okay. So this row is double, so I'm going to just continue to do double, finish my row. And I want to change to this red yarn. So I'm either going to do stripes or whatever. And so the time to change color is partially in this stitch. So we're still working on this row. So we're going to change color kind of on the last step of this row. So you yarn over, enter your work, bring up. So I've got my double crochet. I'm going to bring it through 2. And now the last step, the very last step, I'm going to switch colors and bring it through the last 2. And then I'm going to chain 3. You can kind of pull these tight to keep them in place. And you can see it gives me a nice clean stripe. So this row, you're able to see it goes clear to the end. And when you turn your work and start the next, you just keep going with your stitches, whatever stitches you're doing. But you can see it gives you a nice clean. But if you do it this way, so I finished my stitch, all done with that row. Now I'm going to change color. So I'm going to chain 3 for my double. Turn my work. And we'll look at it and see how that looks. So not such a clean stripe because I did it in the wrong place. But sometimes if you do something wrong, it helps you to understand why it's important to do it the other way. Now, because that's not such a clean stripe, it's not going to look as good, but is it going to ruin your life? Is it going to ruin the whole project? Probably not. Like, you've had worse things than this happen to you, right? But it's nice to know how to do it the correct way. So any questions about that, about changing color? Of course, if you run out of yarn and you're adding more yarn, but you're not changing colors, you can change it at any point, in the stitch. But if you're trying to have a nice clean stripe, that's where you would change it. Okay. Any questions? Another way to do it is if you end your work. So I just completely ended it. I'm done with the gray. I'm not going forward with any more gray. And then if you kind of enter that stitch, and you'd really only do this if you're completely not going to be able to use that color anymore. And then just kind of join it and then kind of go from there. And that looks pretty good as well. And we'll look at that in 1 second.
And when you're changing colors or adding a new ball of the same color, do you want to try and do that at the end of the row, or is it okay to do it in the middle of the row?
The correct answer is probably to always try to do it at the end of the row. But I don't mind doing it in the middle of the row for crochet. What do you think, Claire? I feel like with crochet, it's kind of easier to... I don't think it shows up. Knitting, it tends to show up worse, but with crochet, it doesn't.
Yeah, I think doing it at the end or the beginning of the row is probably best if you can. But if you're working on like an Afghan and you run out halfway through the row, then I'd say go ahead and change it there.
Okay, so I cut my yarn, but if you had a break in your yarn or somebody snuck up behind you and cut your yarn when you weren't looking, that'd be a dirty trick, right? But for whatever reason, I need to rejoin my yarn. So I would probably start with my old yarn like that. I don't know if you would do it this way. And then start it correctly. So that's not going to give me much to weave in. So I would probably back out of this stitch, yarn over. And then instead of, I'd probably trade yarns right there and do it that way. That's how I tend to do it. And I find, and then after you pull that, tighten everything up, I find that gives me a better way of hiding it. And then just move on with your, how do you do it, Claire? Do you do it like that?
I probably, if I'm doing a double crochet, I would wait until the last yarn over and pull through too. But either way is fine, I think. Now we do have a question about
right
turning
here
chains here.
is where you would do it. Okay. Yeah, either way. But I find it if you do it in the middle of a stitch like that, it's easier to kind of hide it. Okay, what was the question, Claire?
We've got a question on turning chains. Sabrina says, with their chain 4 before the triple crochet, it looks odd. Does the chain 4 count as the first stitch? This might be something we cover in next class.
Yeah, that's we might have time to touch on it a little bit. That's a loaded question. And the reason, let me get there. So there's my chain 4. Sorry, excuse me. So there are two completely different ways of doing this. And you have to, when I first learned to crochet, I could never understand this. For some reason, I found it extremely confusing. But if you think about it as two complete separate ways, there's one method where you can, how we've been doing it, how you go in the first stitch, but then that makes this chain really kind of bow out like that. But if you skip the first stitch and go in the second stitch, then the chain doesn't bow out so much. And if you do that, then the chain counts as a first stitch, and then that counts as your second stitch. So when you're marking your stitches, you want to make sure you're putting that stitch marker in the top of your turning chain. And then as you go all the way across, I'll show you what happens. So I've lost a stitch. So now I only have 9 stitches, right? Because I skipped the first one. But the turning chain counts. I don't think I was doing, some of them were double, but whatever. We're just practicing. Let me get to the end. So if the turning chain counts as a stitch, then what's going to happen is I'm going to have to put a stitch in the top of that turning chain. So here's my turning chain from before, and I would have had it marked, and this is where it's very important to have a stitch marker because it's sometimes hard to tell. So I would have it marked, and you just go into that turning chain. And so sometimes it's hard to get in there. And this is a little more advanced. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the pattern will tell you, though, as you're following a pattern, it'll say you have 10 triple crochets. It'll say chain 4. Chain 4 counts as a stitch, or chain 4 does not count as a stitch. It will tell you usually. And then it will say, do a triple crochet in the second chain from the hook if it counts as a stitch. So basically, skip that first one and do it in the second one. And if you're doing that, I'm just going to do double across. And if you're doing that, then you'll also do a chain in the top of your turning chain. But this is where it gets confusing because when I never knew what was right. I never knew the right way to do it. I never knew which was the better way. I would end up mixing them up and combining them. But the best way to do it, they're both correct. They're both 100% correct. It just kind of depends on the pattern or how you'd like it to look. Okay, because I've got my stitch marker on top of my turning chain, it's very easy to find. And so I'm just doing a double. Now's a good time to count my stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I've added a stitch somewhere because I wasn't paying attention. So, but the good news is I know I probably did it in this row. So you just take it out and give it another try. So But it is very confusing. I have this. So this is double crochet with a standard edge, and you can see it does kind of get this this chain 3 kind of does loop out a little bit, and you get kind of a fluted edge. And this is double crochet with the straight edge, and with the straight edge that means where you're skipping the first stitch, going across, and then you're working a stitch in your turning chain. And you can see that does give you a much straighter edge. Two completely different ways of doing it. Both are equally good and equally correct. So I'm going to cover more about this next week. Usually I cover this in Crochet 3, but we're having a little extra time. Any questions about that? I know that can be very confusing. I was very confused by that when I learned.
That is a little tricky. I think probably, obviously, you're going to want to pick which method you're using at the start of your project and then stick to that method for the whole thing. You don't want to be switching back and forth.
That's the most important thing, is to remember that they're two separate projects, or they're two separate methods. And usually the project you're working on, usually the pattern will tell you. So so that's that. I find it easier when I do it. I usually just put a stitch on top of each stitch. I don't skip the one. I usually just go for it and just live my life that way. But whatever works for you. But I do really recommend using the stitch markers, and I really recommend counting your stitches at the end of each row to make sure you know exactly where you are and that you haven't made a mistake. The stitch markers are really your best friend, especially when you're learning. Any other questions? Anything else? Are we ready to look at the pattern?
I was going to say, we've got just under 20 minutes left here, so we should probably go ahead with the pattern.
And again, the pattern is using Heartland, and it is striped, so you can pick two colors that you like. This one is Bryce Canyon, and this one is I can never say it right. Is it Dry to Tortoise? Is that how you say it, Claire? It's a nice beigey.
Tortugas, nice, I think.
Tortugas. This is a nice kind of a gold color. But Heartland comes in so many great colors. You can really choose whatever you want. And so here's the hat. If you follow the pattern exactly. Because I don't really like to be told what to do, I made my hat a little longer. So I'm going to talk about how you can kind of adjust the pattern to make it a little bit. I like a slouchy hat, so I made mine a little bit longer. So let's look at the pattern and see what it's telling us. Okay, so here is our pattern. It's a free pattern on lionbrand.com, so you can print this out at home for free. And it's beginning level, so it's perfect for us. You need one ball of Lion Brand, and this one's calling for Yellowstone, but we chose Bryce Canyon. And this one's using Yosemite, but we chose the Dry to Tortoise for our class. So, of course, you can choose whatever colors you like. You need a J hook, and then large-eyed blunt needles for weaving in your ends. So that's really all you need. A pair of scissors, basic stuff like that. Gauge, it means if your stitches are the exact same size as the designer stitches, then your hat will be the exact same size as the designer's hat. But hats are small projects, and usually if your gauge is off just a little bit, it's not such a crisis. So you don't really have to worry too much about gauge at this point. And then just some notes, the hat is worked in one piece and then seamed. The yarn color is changed on every other row to create the stripe. So just some basic information about what if you're making a really complicated sweater or something, that kind of information comes in handy, because sometimes the logic behind the way that project is created might be a little different than what you were expecting. So this pattern gives us a chart. And so I like a chart because I can look at the chart and analyze what it's telling me. And then I can read the written directions. And if I have any questions, I can kind of compare the two. And it really helps you figure out what's actually happening. So this is just a little snapshot of it. So this is the chain, these little ovals. And if you look down here at the key, you can see this little kind of oval or eye shape is the chain. And like this long letter T with the line in the middle of it is a double crochet. And then the T without the line is a half double. And then the X is a single. So what this is telling us then is you do your chain and then you do a double crochet in each chain here. So, and then you go up 3, you do your double crochet back. I'm sorry, I'm instructing. So you start here actually, and then you have your 3 chains for the side, but that chain on the side is just on the side. And then you do a double crochet in each chain. So this does not count as a stitch all the way across. And then you chain your 3 for the height. And again, it's not counting as a stitch. It's not part of that stitch. So you can see it's kind of off the edge. And then you put 1 double crochet on top of each double crochet as you're going across. And then here you chain 2. And then you're working half double. Chain 2, half double. Chain 1, single. Chain 1, single. And then you're back to half double. So it's easy to kind of follow the chart. Now, if we're going to look, any questions about the chart? I know I kind of mixed it up at the beginning, but it's pretty self-explanatory as you go. Any questions? So with my really long hat, the one I made longer, instead of chaining 33, I chained 42. So I made mine a little bit longer. So you can play with the measurements and do kind of whatever you want. It tells us with A, you're going to double crochet in the 4th chain from the hook. The 3 skip chains do not count as a stitch. So that's what it's telling us. The 3 skipped chains do not count as a stitch. And you're going to work in each stitch across. You will have 30 double crochets at the end of this row. And if we look up here, there's our 30 stitches. There's our 3. So we're going to chain 33 and then put a double crochet in each one. So it's making sense according to the chart. With A, chain 3 does not count as a stitch. Turn, double crochet in each stitch across, change to B in the last stitch. So you're going to change colors in the last stitch in the exact way I showed you how to change colors before. So rows 3 and 4, so both of these rows with B, and you can pick whichever color you want to be A and whichever one you want to be B. You're going to chain 2 because we're going to be doing half double. So chain 2, it does not count as a stitch, so it does not count. Turn, half double crochet in each stitch across, change to A in the last stitch of row 4. So you're going to go all the way across with B, up, all the way back across with B, and then you're going to change back to A. Chain 1 does not count as a stitch. Turn, single crochet in each stitch across, and change back to B in the last stitch of row 6. And then you'll just continue on. You'll be rows 7 and 8. You repeat B. With B, you repeat rows 3 and 4. And then with 9 and 10, you repeat row 2. And you just kind of keep going. So you keep repeating rows 3 through 10 until the piece measures about 19 inches. Now, if you're making this for a child who has a very, maybe a 5 or 6 year old, you might not want to go 19 inches. You can measure their head, and if say their head is 16 inches, then maybe you make the hat like 15 or 15 and a half inches. Or if you have a friend that has like very, very thick hair or a very, very large head, maybe their head's 24 inches. So instead of 19 inches, maybe you're going to go until the hat measures 22 inches or 23, because you want it to be snug and tight on the head. But this is the best part about making stuff, is you can custom make it to suit your own needs or for the needs of whomever you're making it for. Okay. Any questions? I'm going to show you how to seam it really quick. So what you end up with when you're finished is kind of like a rectangle. Take this seam out really quick. While I'm taking this seam out, do we have any questions about the chart or the written pattern? Any questions at all?
First, I will say a little note that this particular pattern, the hat is made basically side to side. So the length that you're crocheting is actually the circumference of the head, which is a little bit different than probably most other hat patterns.
Oh, I mix that up, didn't I?
No, I think you said it right. I was just clarifying. Yes,
okay.
Yes. And then we do have a question. When you're going back to the first color again, are you cutting the yarn between each color change, or are you carrying it up the side?
That's a good question. So what I did when I made this one, and you can see I carried mine up the side. They're not super long strands, so you know it depends. I knew I was going to be seaming this, and I could hide that in my seam. If I was making a scarf, I might not, want to have that on the edge of my scarf. I might cut them and weave them. Would you cut them and weave them in, Claire, on a scarf, or would you leave them?
If the scarf edge is going to be visible, I would probably cut them and weave them in, or plan to do like a little bit of a border to hide that.
Yeah. Other than that, but because I knew I was going to be hiding them in the seam, then I just did it that way. But it's up to you. And you could just do a single crochet along the edge to kind of hide that. It just depends. Was there another question, Claire? Did I miss a question?
Nope, that was it.
All right, so we need a large-eyed blunt needle for our seaming. And once you finish your hat, it's going to be just like a rectangular piece of fabric. And then you just want to kind of take your sewing needle, and it doesn't have to be fussy. You just kind of want to go every 1/4 inch, every 1/2 inch, but you don't have to fuss over it too much. See, I'm not really even paying attention. You just don't want to go deep. Like you don't all of a sudden want to get down too deep. And you probably don't want to skip any great big spaces either. So just don't get too fussy with this, because it doesn't really matter. Just make sure you're doing it kind of right along the edge. Just going up and down, in and out, all along that edge. Okay. And then pull it all the way through. And then you're going to cinch it up really tight. And then I would probably go back through it one more time. I got a knot in my yarn. Don't get a knot in your yarn. I'm not sure how I did that. I can always manage to get a knot in my yarn, so try to avoid that. Kind of go back through the beginning and cinch it up really tight. You don't want to break your yarn by mistake. And then I kind of go one more time through it again to kind of cinch it so it doesn't come untied or unloose. Because you don't want a hole opening up on top of your hat. So make sure it's really nice and snug. And then we're just going to seam this. And it's really easier to seam than you think it is. So we're just going to go along the edge. We're just going to pick up this very edge. And you can do a running stitch or the whip stitch. And so I'm just picking up kind of like right there. If you were going to crochet, that's where you would go, right? If you're going to crochet along this edge, you would find there's 2 and find those 2 there. And if you're always going, if you're following kind of your stitches or your chain, and you're always only going 2 like strands of yarn deep, then your seam's going to look quite nice and neat because they're going to be spaced out the same and always going the same depth. So I'm just picking up just these, like you don't want to randomly go down here or go really deep. Just pick up 2 along the edge and then kind of pick up, if you were going to crochet, kind of look and see where those crochet stitches would be. And instead of crocheting through them, we're going to be sewing through them. So if you don't have any seaming experience, you don't have to be intimidated. And I like to hold mine like this, where I put my finger between the 2 sides, and it kind of helps me keep track of what I'm looking at. And then I just kind of advance that as I'm going along. Okay, so this is the running stitch or the basting stitch. I'm going to show you the whip stitch, and then you can pick which one you like best. So the whip stitch, you jump over your seam, and so you're always jumping over the seam and entering it from the same side. Exit it from this side, taking my yarn back over the seam and entering it from that side. But you still want to make sure you're always going the same depth and spacing your stitches out nicely. And either one of these seams, they both look equally nice. I like the running stitch better. What do you like better, Claire?
I think I like the running stitch better as well. Although if you did want to leave your seam visible, I think the whip stitch is a nice sort of decorative one.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like most people tend to like the whip stitch better. I'm not sure, but I like this running stitch better. But, you wouldn't want to alternate like I'm alternating now. You'd want to pick one and then turn it right side out. And you can see it looks pretty nice. See, I feel like that looks pretty good. So, and then you can put a pom-pom on the top or not. You could maybe sew some decorative buttons on it if you wanted it to be. I made this hat following the same pattern, although I chained 42. No, for this one, I think I chained 43. And instead of following the design, I just did half double the whole way across. I ran out of brown yarn, so I just finished it with this black stripe. So I did half double, just finished it with a black stripe, and then seamed it and called it a day. So once you've learned how to make this hat and you followed the pattern for this hat, then you can make just a few small changes and make it any way you want. So, and then now you're a crochet designer. So you see how easy it was to become a crochet designer? What do you think, Claire?
That is nice when you have sort of a basic pattern under your belt, and then you can modify it with different stitches and different stripe thicknesses and different yarns.
Yep. That's the best part about crochet. You can do anything you want. Sometimes you'll be sorry you did it. Sometimes it was not a good idea. But you do have the freedom to do whatever you want. Okay. So I think that's pretty much it, unless if there are any other questions.
At least it's easy to rip things out if you do make a mistake or change your mind.
Yes. Crochet is forgiving like that. It's kind of easy to go back.
I wanted to remind everybody, in case you missed our Crochet 101 class from earlier this week. That recording should be up on the Lion Brand YouTube channel by the end of today. And then the recording of this class should be up probably early next week. If you need the handout again or the pattern, I'll go ahead and put that link into the chat right now. And then hopefully we will see some of you back here for Crochet 103 next Tuesday.
Okay. Thanks for coming to class. Don't forget to practice. It takes lots of practice. So after you practice a little bit, you'll be ready.